A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headache.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, Herman, I was looking at my terminal the other day, watching Claude code just fly through a refactor, and I had this weird moment of nostalgia for 2023. Back then, we were all obsessed with these complex agentic frameworks that promised to simulate an entire software company with one prompt. Today's prompt from Daniel is asking us to revisit that exact tension. He wants us to dig into MetaGPT, SWE-agent, and OpenHands to see if these team of dev frameworks actually still hold water in 2026, or if they've been rendered obsolete by the sheer raw power of models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet and native orchestration.
It is a fascinating pivot point in the industry, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. The landscape has shifted so dramatically. We have moved from wanting a chatbot that codes to wanting an autonomous engineer, and the architectural choices behind those two goals are worlds apart. By the way, speaking of the tech behind the scenes, today's episode is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is interesting to see how these models are now writing the very scripts where we analyze their capabilities.
It is a bit meta, isn't it? A model writing a script about frameworks that manage other models. But let's get into the meat of this. The single-agent coding assistant is basically the baseline now. If you aren't using a model that can at least run a linter and fix its own typos, you are living in the Stone Age. But Daniel is pointing us toward the heavy hitters, the frameworks that don't just chat, but supposedly work as a cohesive unit.
Right. And to understand if they are still relevant, we have to look at what they were trying to solve in the first place. Think about the three big ones Daniel mentioned. You have MetaGPT, which is all about standard operating procedures, or SOPs. Then you have SWE-agent, which focused on the agent-computer interface, making the terminal more readable for a machine. And finally, OpenHands, which used to be called OpenDevin, which is really an execution sandbox with an event-driven runtime.
So, before we go deeper, let's establish the baseline. If I am sitting at my desk and I need a new feature, I usually just fire up Claude Code. It has native tool use, it can see my files, it can run my tests. Why on earth would I want to introduce the overhead of a product manager agent and an architect agent just to write a simple Flask API? Is the team of agents approach just a way to make us feel like we are managers, or is there a real mechanical advantage there?
That is the central question. When you look at MetaGPT, which came out back in July of 2023, the core thesis was that LLMs are prone to drift and hallucination when given a massive open-ended task. Their solution was to force the model into a rigid structure. Instead of saying, "Write me an app," you have a sequence. The product manager agent writes a product requirements document. Then the architect agent looks at that document and creates a system design. Only then does the engineer start writing code.
It sounds like a lot of paperwork for a robot.
It is. But that paperwork serves as a form of state management. In 2026, even with context windows reaching 200,000 tokens or more, the thinking process can still get muddled. By forcing the model to generate a PRD first, you are essentially creating a persistent memory of the requirements that doesn't get lost in the noise of a long conversation. It is a way to reduce the temperature of the project, so to speak, by keeping the model on a very narrow track defined by its current role.
Okay, I can see the value in that for a massive project. If I'm building a complex distributed system, I don't want the model improvising the database schema in the middle of writing a UI component. But what about SWE-agent? That one feels a bit more low-level than the corporate simulation of MetaGPT.
SWE-agent is brilliant because it addresses the interface problem. Standard bash terminals are designed for humans. We have eyes that can scan 100 lines of logs and pick out the error. An LLM sees that same output as a massive wall of tokens that eats up its context window and confuses its attention mechanism. SWE-agent introduced what they call the Agent Computer Interface, or ACI. It gives the model specialized commands like search dir or scroll or edit file with specific line numbers.
So it's like giving the AI a pair of glasses instead of making it squint at a tiny screen.
Topic. Wait, that is a good way to put it. It simplifies the observation space. When the model uses a search command in SWE-agent, it doesn't get the raw output of a grep command. It gets a structured, truncated summary that is optimized for its reasoning capabilities. This is why SWE-agent was able to hit such high scores on the SWE benchmarks early on. It wasn't necessarily that the underlying model was smarter, but that its hands were more precise.
This leads us to OpenHands. I remember when it was OpenDevin. It felt like the community's answer to the proprietary AI software engineer hype. They just released a big update, version 0.20, with this event-driven runtime. What does that actually mean for a dev sitting in Jerusalem or Dublin or wherever, trying to get work done?
The event-driven runtime in OpenHands is a game changer for long-running tasks. In a standard Claude code session, the interaction is linear. You talk, it acts, you talk back. If you have a task that takes 10 minutes to run, maybe a massive test suite or a complex build, the state of that session is often tied to your active terminal. OpenHands treats everything as an event in a sandbox container. The agent can trigger a task, detach from it to go work on something else or wait for a signal, and then react when the task completes.
So it's more like a real colleague who says, "Hey, I'm running the migrations, I'll ping you when they're done," rather than a script that hangs your terminal.
Precisely. And that sandbox is critical. OpenHands runs everything in a Docker container by default. If the agent decides it needs to RMRF something because it thinks that is the fix, it only destroys the sandbox, not your actual machine. That safety layer allows for a level of autonomy that you might be hesitant to give to a naked agent running on your local metal.
I want to push back on the MetaGPT SOP thing for a second. We've seen models get so much better at following complex instructions within a single prompt. If I give Claude 3.7 a very detailed system prompt that tells it to act as an architect first, then a coder, does that negate the need for the multi-agent handoff? Every time agents talk to each other, you lose information. It's like a game of telephone. Does the rigidity of MetaGPT actually hurt more than it helps in 2026?
That is, the orchestration tax. You are right that every handoff introduces a chance for a translation error between agents. If the architect agent uses a term that the engineer agent interprets differently, the whole project can veer off course. However, the counterargument is separation of concerns. Even a model as smart as Claude 3.7 can suffer from over-eagerness. If you ask it to architect and code at the same time, it often rushes to the code because that's where the reward is in its training data.
It's like a developer who wants to start typing before the whiteboard is even dry.
Yes, MetaGPT's SOPs act as a physical barrier. The engineer agent literally cannot start until the architect agent has produced a valid JSON file defining the classes. It forces a chain of thought at the organizational level, not just the token level. For a small script, it is definitely overkill. But for a repository with 50 files, having that source of truth document that was generated by a dedicated architect pass is often more reliable than hoping the model remembers the design patterns it decided on 3,000 tokens ago.
Let's talk about the agent-computer interface in SWE-agent again. You mentioned it uses specialized commands, but Claude Code now has native tool use. It can read files, it can run bash. Is there still a reason to use a middleman interface like SWE-agent's ACI? Or has the glasses analogy been rendered moot because the models now have 20/20 vision?
It is not just about vision, it is about action efficiency. Native tool use is great, but it is often very verbose. If a model wants to find a specific function in a 10,000-line code base using standard bash, it might run 5 or 6 commands. ls, then grep, then cat, getting a lot of noise back each time. SWE-agent's ACI is like a macro for the brain. It allows the model to say, find this symbol, and get back exactly what it needs in one turn. This reduces the number of turns in the conversation, which lowers costs and, more importantly, reduces the chance of the model getting distracted by irrelevant output.
I see. So it's about the signal-to-noise ratio in the context window. If the agent's history is filled with 500 lines of npm install logs, it might forget that it was supposed to be fixing a specific race condition in the auth logic.
And that brings us to the human-in-the-loop aspect of OpenHands. This is where I think the team of dev frameworks really pull ahead of simple orchestration. In OpenHands, you have a visual dashboard. You can see the agent's thoughts, its plan, and its terminal all in one place. If you see it heading down a rabbit hole like trying to refactor an entire library when it just needed to change one constant, you can pause it, edit its plan, and tell it to get back on track.
That pause and edit is huge. With Claude Code, if it starts doing something stupid, I usually have to Control-C and then try to explain in a new prompt what went wrong. It feels very restart heavy.
OpenHands treats the state of the agent as an editable object. Because it is event-driven, you can actually go into the event log and undo the last 3 actions, then give a new instruction. It is much closer to pair programming than prompting a script. This is why OpenHands has gained so much traction in 2026. It isn't just about the AI being smart, it's about the human being able to steer the AI without breaking its momentum.
So, if we're looking at a decision matrix here for someone like Daniel, or any developer listening, when do you reach for these instead of just using the standard tools? Let's say I'm starting a new project. I've got a vague idea for a microservice that handles image processing. I know the tech stack, Python, FastAPI, Redis.
If the requirements are vague, I would actually start with MetaGPT. Its strength is decomposition. It will force you to define the user stories and the data flow before a single line of Python is written. It acts as a senior lead who makes you think through the boring stuff. For a fresh project, that structure is invaluable for preventing scope creep from the AI itself.
And if I'm jumping into a massive existing codebase, say a legacy Java project where I need to find and fix a bug in the middleware,
That is where SWE-agent shines. Its agent-computer interface is purpose-built for software engineering tasks, hence the name. It is incredibly good at navigating large, unfamiliar file structures without getting lost. It uses those specialized search and scroll commands to build a mental map of the project much faster than a generic agent would. It is the explorer of the group.
and OpenHands, where does it sit in the daily workflow?
OpenHands is your long-term resident. If you have a task that is going to take an hour of thinking and testing, like migrating a database or upgrading a bunch of breaking dependencies, you set it up in OpenHands. You can walk away, get a coffee, check on your son Ezra, and come back to see a full report of what it tried, what failed, and where it ended up. It is the framework for autonomous background tasks because of that robust state management and sandboxed environment.
I have to ask about the Claude Code counterargument again, though. Anthropic has been very aggressive with their updates. Claude 3.7 has this extended thinking mode, where it can basically simulate its own internal team before it outputs anything. It's doing the architect and engineer passes inside its own latent space. Does that eventually make MetaGPT's multi-agent approach look like a Rube Goldberg machine?
It is a classic vertical versus horizontal integration debate. Anthropic is doing vertical integration, putting the reasoning, the tools, and the state management inside the model's weights and the API's thinking blocks. MetaGPT and OpenHands are horizontal. They are building an operating system for agents that can swap out the CPU, which is the LLM.
Right. So if a new model comes out tomorrow from Google or Meta or OpenAI that is twice as fast as Claude, the OpenHands users just change a line in their config file. The Claude Code users are stuck waiting for Anthropic to update their specific tool.
Correct. And there is also the specialization factor. One thing we often miss is that these frameworks allow you to use small language models, or SLMs, for specific subtasks. You might use Claude 3.7 for the architect role because it's brilliant at high-level reasoning, but you could use a much faster, cheaper model for the unit test writer role. In MetaGPT, you can actually assign different models to different roles in the SOP.
That's a huge cost-saving measure if you're running these things at scale. You don't need a PhD-level model to write basic boilerplate or documentation. You can delegate that to a junior model.
And that is the hive mind approach we talked about in a previous episode. The idea that a collection of specialized smaller brains can sometimes outperform one giant general-purpose brain, especially when you factor in latency and cost. But there is a hidden cost to these frameworks too: maintenance. I've tried setting up some of these, and sometimes you spend more time debugging the agent framework than actually writing code. The Docker container failed to mount, or the API handoff timed out.
It's more work to manage the robots than to do the work trap. I've definitely been there. You're trying to fix a bug in your CSS, and suddenly you're 3 layers deep in a Python traceback because the product manager agent couldn't parse the architect agent's JSON. It's enough to make you want to just go back to Vim in a prayer.
Which is why the simplicity of Claude Code is its biggest feature. It is zero config. You just run the command, and it works. For 80% of tasks, that is going to win every time. The frameworks like MetaGPT and OpenHands are for that other 20%, the hard mode of software engineering.
So, let's look at the future. We're in early 2026. Where do these tools go from here? Do they just become plugins for our IDEs, or do they become the IDE itself?
I think we are seeing a convergence. Look at how OpenHands is evolving. It's starting to look less like a command line tool and more like an autonomous IDE. I suspect we will see a world where your code editor is actually just a state viewer for an underlying agent swarm. You don't open a file, you subscribe to a task that an agent is working on.
That's a wild thought. The team of devs isn't a framework you run, it's the environment you live in. But wait, if that's true, what happens to the human developer? Are we just the product managers now, giving SOPs to the MetaGPT-style architects?
In some ways, yes. But as we've seen, the hallucination problem hasn't fully gone away. It has just moved to a higher level of abstraction. Instead of the AI hallucinating a variable name, it might hallucinate an entire system architecture that is technically correct, but practically impossible to maintain or scale. The human's job shifts from writing lines of code to validating architectural integrity. You become the judge rather than the worker.
I'm not sure if that sounds more or less stressful. Instead of worrying about a semicolon, I'm worrying if my AI architect just committed us to a microservices architecture that will cost $10,000 a month for a simple blog.
Which brings us back to why these frameworks are so important. They provide audit trails. In MetaGPT, you can look at the PRD and the system design documents. If the project goes off the rails, you can point to the exact moment the architect made a bad decision. In a black box single agent chat, it's a lot harder to figure out where the reasoning failed.
It's explainable AI applied to the software development lifecycle. I can see the conservative case for this. It's about accountability and structure. You don't just let a black box write your company's core infrastructure without a paper trail. You want a process that looks like a traditional, proven engineering workflow, even if the engineers are all running on GPUs.
That is a very astute observation, Korn. It is about institutional knowledge. When a human developer leaves a company, they take their mental model with them. But if your team of agents is using a framework like MetaGPT, the mental model is literally stored as a series of documents and state logs. The framework becomes the repository of how the software works.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate one more time. We've talked about MetaGPT, the company simulation, SWE-agent, the specialized terminal, and OpenHands, the sandboxed environment. If you were a betting man, which I know you aren't, you're a donkey. You prefer a sure thing. Which of these architectures survives the next 2 years? Or do they all get eaten by native agent mode in the big frontier models?
I think OpenHands has the best survival strategy because it focuses on infrastructure. The event-driven runtime and the sandbox container are things that a model API can't easily replace. Even if Claude becomes 10 times smarter, you still need a safe, persistent place for it to live and work on a codebase for 3 days straight. MetaGPT's SOPs might get absorbed into the model's internal reasoning, but the workbench provided by OpenHands is a separate layer of the stack.
It's the operating system versus the application. OpenHands is trying to be the OS for AI engineers.
And SWE-agent's contributions. The ACI will likely be absorbed into how models are trained. We are already seeing agentic fine-tuning where models are specifically trained to use those scroll and search commands. So SWE-agent might disappear as a separate tool, but live on as a standard for how models interact with computers.
So for Daniel's sake, let's summarize the practical takeaways here. If you're a dev in 2026, how should you be thinking about these weird prompts of his?
Takeaway number 1. Use MetaGPT or a similar SOP-based framework when you are in the discovery or greenfield phase. If you don't have a clear plan, the framework's rigidity will save you from the AI's tendency to over-engineer or hallucinate scope. It forces a measured approach.
Takeaway number 2. If you are doing deep navigation in a legacy or massive codebase, don't just rely on a chat box. Use something with a specialized agent-computer interface, like SWE-agent. The signal-to-noise ratio in your context window is your most valuable resource. Don't waste it on NPM logs.
And takeaway number 3, for long-running background. Engineering tasks, you need a state-managed sandbox like OpenHands. Don't tie your terminal up for an hour. Use a framework that treats the agent as a persistent process that you can check in on and steer without having to restart the whole conversation.
I'd add a fourth one. Don't be afraid to be the boss. The biggest mistake people make with these frameworks is treating them like magic wands. They're more like interns who are incredibly fast but have zero common sense. You have to read the PRD the agent generates. You have to look at the system design. If you skip the human-in-the-loop part, you're just automating the creation of technical debt.
Automating the creation of technical debt. That might be the quote of the episode, Corn. It is so true. These tools are force multipliers, but if you multiply 0, you still get 0. Or worse, if you multiply a bad idea, you just get a catastrophically large bad idea very quickly.
Which is why I'm glad I'm a sloth. I move slowly enough to catch the bad ideas before they get multiplied. You, on the other hand, are a donkey. You're ready to carry the whole load of a multi-agent framework on your back.
I do enjoy the intellectual weight of it. There is something genuinely exciting about seeing a team of agents collaborate. Even if it's just a simulation, it's a glimpse into the future of how all work, not just coding, might be organized. We are moving from task management to orchestration management.
It's a bit scary, but also kind of a relief. I'm looking forward to the day I can just say, team, deal with the Jira tickets, and then go take a nap in my tree.
We are getting closer every day, Corn, but until then, we still have to be the ones prompting the team.
Fair enough. Well, this has been a deep dive. I feel like I understand the why behind these frameworks a lot better now. It's not just more agents, more better. It's about structure, interface, and state.
Precisely. It is about building a better cage for the lightning we've caught in these models.
Caging the lightning. You're getting poetic in your old age, Herman Boppleberry.
It happens when you spend too much time reading research papers on event-driven runtimes.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to say thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. It's fitting that a serverless GPU platform is supporting a discussion about agentic frameworks.
If you found this dive into MetaGPT and OpenHands useful, or if you're out there building your own team of devs, we'd love to hear about it. Find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the RSS feed.
And if you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really does help us reach more curious minds, human or otherwise. This has been My Weird Prompts. I'm Corn.
And I'm Herman.
We'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, and maybe don't let your agents anything without a sandbox.
Good advice. Goodbye.
See ya. See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our